Here in Belfast, the Stormont Assembly has reconvened after a gap of 3 years. It is a further consolidation of the 20-year peace process. But with further political change on the way, can that peace hold? Join us on the Alex Salmond Show, on air and online. Welcome to the Alex Salmond Show from Belfast. Here, the Stormont Assembly has reconvened after a gap of 3 years. It is a further consolidation of the 20-year peace process. But with further political change on the way, can that peace hold?
In this three-part series on the future of Northern Ireland, Alex speaks to those who have enabled the peace process and then to members of both political communities. After 4 years, where Northern Irish politics was centre stage, largely because of its impact on the tight parliamentary arithmetic of Brexit, we are now in a position where it is Brexit which is impacting on the politics of Northern Ireland. The decisive Christmas election in the UK helped break the Assembly deadlock, which had paralysed the province's domestic politics since 2017, and the Stormont Assembly was reconvened within a month of polling day. The British politician who had helped broker the deal was publicly thanked by the Prime Minister and then promptly dumped from the Cabinet in last month's reshuffle. Julian Smith held the post of Northern Irish Secretary for a mere 204 days, but he packed a great deal into his term of office. And so after 3 years frozen in aspic, the Assembly was back in business. Emboldened by this success, the Taoiseach called an election in the Republic, only to find that while he got bogged down in domestic issues, Sinn Féin gained credibility from being back in government in the north. The subsequent electoral breakthrough means that Sinn Féin are competing for political leadership in both the north and the south of Ireland, and on a platform of seeking a border poll. So what do these developments mean for the future of Northern Ireland? As will become clear, the process of Brexit and political changes taking place in Ireland North and South has caused both soul-searching and new thinking among both the nationalist and unionist communities. Now back to Alex in Belfast.
A peace process requires peacemakers, politicians with the imagination to leap across history, but it also has to be understood. Today I speak to Professor Duncan Morrow, Northern Ireland's foremost academic, on the subject of anti-bigotry and reconciliation between communities. Well, Professor Morrow, welcome to the Alex Salmond Show.
Thank you very much. Glad to be here.
Now, you are probably the most published academic in terms of reconciliation between the communities in Northern Ireland, and indeed, of course, have used your expertise to help the anti-sectarian drive in Scotland. How do you get communities to stop distrusting each other?
Well, it's not a simple question, and it goes back to so many different dimensions, and I suppose actually for us it was trying to find practical ways into that right along the board. So, I mean, everything in Northern Ireland is affected in some way by this division. So you're talking about how do you sort the police? Can you get the politicians to work together? Can you then get schools to start to educate people in a different way? How do people at local level actually stop just walking past each other, but start to run things together? And a lot of our work was really just almost stepping out onto that ice, trying to find the practical ways forward on an interface, you know, in the trade unions, in a workplace, in schools. And it was, in many ways, an experiment. It's, how do you do it? I mean, and we found quite a lot of different answers for that in different ways.
You say we. Who are you speaking about?
Well, I think there's a kind of different levels of we. I was in the Community Relations Council, and I was very much involved in trying to support and develop those kind of initiatives. So we were actually looking for them. But we were doing that, I suppose, on behalf of the whole community. And really, when you look at the number of actors, if you count what politicians have had to contemplate, working with people who they associated with, well, it's not to put too fine a point in it, murder campaigns, with systems which they profoundly found unjust, they had to work together. The police had to find a way to engage with communities who previously didn't want to know them. You had schools trying to bring people together where parents were looking at them saying, what are you doing? You had interfaces where people were throwing stones saying, how do you cut that down? So the we was actually very broad. This has been 20 years of trying to find the cracks, I think. And
where is the space to have that dialogue? I mean, I know yourself, but your father were very influential in the foundation of the Corrymeela community. But there must be, in the modern Northern Ireland, there must be spaces taking place in the political arena, out with politics, between communities, online. How do you find a space where people can have that dialogue?
I actually think you're talking about the actual definition of what we mean by the peace process, which is when things are really hot, I have to say the spaces become narrower and narrower and narrower. They're only the small spaces. I think that was our experience in Corrymeela, was how do you keep it alive in the middle of what is effectively a war is too strong, but nevertheless a massive conflict where people are orienting themselves towards that. I think the peace process has all been about answering that question. In other words, there shouldn't be anywhere where we can't have that conversation. So politics was a really key arena and still remains actually one of the more complex arenas because it keeps breaking down under the stresses of that. You have institutions which are really important because they're carrying the law and people's sense of justice. So how do people coalesce around issues of what good policing looks like, where that's been a theme? And I use that quite often because I think that's a big one. Another one is schools. You know, we have a whole load of institutions which are either places where people learn to be adults in one way or another way. So how do you use those? There are community organisations, but also workplaces need to learn to treat people fairly and straight. And if that's not happening and if people feel intimidated in their workplace, so when you talk about space, what I would say is there are opportunities everywhere. The question is, what's actually available now, and keeping that opportunistic kind of approach to these things, but also understanding that it's comprehensive in the end.
To what extent is it now realistic to think of two tribes in Northern Ireland, a nationalist tribe and a unionist tribe? Is that now a totally dramatic oversimplification, or does it still have the kernel of truth?
I think you have to be careful before you walk away too quickly. And there is no doubt that things have shifted a bit, particularly for some. I mean, I would say for under 40s who've had an experience over the last 20 years of a more open, plural society, no longer simple. They travel, they are interested in social change, so issues like gay marriage or abortion have taken their enthusiasm more than the constitutional issue, and they actually resist being pigeonholed back into this. But if you ask a question like Brexit asks, you know, where does the border go? Then people start to take a view again. And one of the questions we don't know is, will they take a slightly different view because it's asked by Brexit than they did before? Is there new constellations emerging? We're in that process now, and that's the question we're asking now.
Now, Duncan, I'm going to ask you to take a leap of the imagination. Let's say I was an Ulster Unionist, and I was looking at the prospect of a border in the Irish Sea. I'd been sold out by Boris Johnson, as I would see it, and I would be fearful of the future. Is it the role of peacemakers, conciliators, dialogue enablers to reassure me, or is that something really I've got to do myself through the process of politics?
I think the job that I would have in that context is, where do I get or provide the context where unsafe conversations can actually happen without there being disastrous? And I think sometimes people think, you know, trying to make peace is about avoiding the issues. It's not at all. Actually, in a funny, strange way, it's about going head on into them, but then trying to create the context within which I can actually face it and begin to address it with the real people I have to address it with. So the question you ask, where does a unionist go now? I think I was at a meeting last night where somebody remarked, the difficulty is unionism doesn't want to have this conversation because they're frightened that if they start the conversation, they'll make it real about where we go with the United Ireland and so on. And there is a complexity around that. But I think it might be possible to design things where, if not unionism, but unionists begin to explore the ice, at least even to find out what it is they can and can't accept, and begin to put conversations in a more complex way. But politics, in the end, will have to deal with this, because politics, in the end, will also shape the situation we're in. Because of Boris Johnson's decisions, we're in one situation. if it had been different 3 months ago, we were in a different situation. We have to keep changing the context, but we have to keep talking about, well, where do you have the safe place for the real conversations, not for the avoidance, but for the real things.
I'd say I was probably much easier, much less of a leap of the imagination, an Irish nationalist politician, apparently winning the border issue in the sense that the border seems to be in the Irish Sea, or going to be, from Brexit, but perhaps frightened that the loss of the European overlay puts at risk some of the guarantees from the Good Friday Agreement. So how do I get reassured? Is it exactly the same process for me?
It's never exactly the same. No, it's not. It's a different process because the fears aren't the same, even though they're interconnected. I would say for Irish nationalism, as it contemplates in real terms, what does a new Ireland or a united Ireland look like? Actually, at the moment, there's a big gap there because a lot of it has been rhetoric. A lot of it has been talk. It's been based on a loss that happened 100 years ago rather than a plan for what's actually real in the European context now. And I think, for example, some of the issues that are arising are people in the north who've lived through 40 years of conflict and 60 years before that of feeling that they were separated don't have the same experience or the same understanding of this as people who lived outside that. And the Irish conversation has to begin in a different way. So everybody has chairs shifting here and everybody's going to have to reorientate their conversations.
And is it possible for politicians from both communities to be fearful simultaneously? So it's not a matter of one is obviously losing and one is obviously winning.
Yeah.
That both can actually be looking at the worst side of this. And how can it be, if that's possible, is it possible to make both communities look at the best side of it?
Well, I think you're actually describing nearly what we're seeing at this moment, which is, I think you could track alienation from British politics as it is currently experienced, but it hasn't yet crystallised into a huge demand for a united Ireland. So both sides are uncertain about where this goes, and nobody really is certain. And at the other side, I think politicians are nervous to give too much shape to this. So a lot of this lies, and you asked where the space is, in what the language of now is deliberative conversations, civic conversations, places where people begin to explore this without prejudice to the political outcome, because they need to narrow the ground onto what the real issues are and actually explore before politicians take a view. But time may not be on our side. I mean, things are happening. These decisions about the border will happen within a year. Whatever happens, we will be in a changed circumstance in 12 months' time. And again, we have to calibrate that. So I don't want to give you too simple an answer. Civic society has a massive opportunity. Academics have a massive opportunity. Media has a massive opportunity to begin to explore these things. Politicians will need to prepare themselves, but we'll have to keep calibrating it to reality.
And one last question on this. When you speak to, let's say, a group of under 30s, not just young people, but people under the age of 30, youngish, let's call them, is their attitude, what are you talking about? There are many other priorities that society should be looking at than the traditional divides. And is that because they haven't lived through the troubles, or is it because just society is opening up and changing in so many ways and people in Northern Ireland are having the same influences as elsewhere?
Well, I think there's complicated answers, but there are some young people who are still stuck, I suppose if that's the right word, but still caught in the old stuff, and some of the areas you would meet that. But many young people, as you say, climate change is the issue, or the issue is what do we do about relationships when gender even is being discussed. All of these conversations are live. There may be at some level a kind of resentment for some of the young people that this conversation is coming back at them. The Good Friday Agreement was meant in some ways to put the old stuff to bed to allow that to flourish. Brexit is something which hasn't really been driven from Northern Ireland, it's been driven from outside. So there are young people, I think, who are trying to adjust themselves to the fact that a conversation's on the table that isn't their conversation. But maybe also they'll bring something new to it. They'll bring a solution which says, actually, we're not looking for the old type of solution, we're looking to use this as an opportunity to reconfigure what we do, and they may have a decisive influence.
Welcome back. I'm speaking to Professor Duncan Morrow, Northern Ireland's foremost academic on the subject of reconciliation between communities. In your role as a reconciler, let's call you that, an enabler perhaps. Do you sometimes, when you're seeing the political debate in the north of Ireland, and let's not deal with names of politicians, but do you see perhaps a politician saying something or doing something or making an initiative, and you say, ha, you know, that's right on the mark, regardless of which party or which community? Do you see sometimes the spark of something that you've been waiting to hear, or is the political dialogue still trapped in old slogans?
I think everybody would say we have seen some really quite remarkable things here. You know, even those very early images of devolution are all kind of miracles against the backdrop here. These are people working together.
The Chuckle Brothers, this is Martin McGuinness,
right back to the Chuckle Brothers.
And Ian Paisley together.
Absolutely. I mean, who could ever have predicted that from where we were 20 years before that? Nobody. When a young constable was killed by a dissident group in about 10 years ago, Peter Robinson went to the service and the GAA carried the coffin of the young policeman. Those were both symbols to me of, wow, that couldn't have happened before.
And the GAA
were the people who are the Irish Cultural Association, who were long associated with Irish nationalism and very critical of the police. But because one of their members was a new policeman, they carried the coffin. The First Minister, who by his religious convictions normally wouldn't go into a Catholic church, went to the funeral. These may seem like small things, but symbolically they were very important for Northern Ireland, and I don't think we can quite go back from there.
Now, can I put to you something that many people would say when they visited Northern Ireland in the past? They would come back with a hugely positive impression of the friendliness, the gregarious nature, the open-heartedness of the people, and would say with you, well, how on earth can what I experienced be reconciled with the violence that they were seeing these days on the television screens? Is that a lesson that any society, regardless of how friendly and open-hearted, can descend into the pit or the abyss?
Oh, certainly it is. And in some ways, you know, the humour is driven by the fact that that's how you cope. You know, you have to, you turn it into a joke, or the warmth is in some ways, because people know that matters in the context of a conflict. I don't think of myself as a reconciler in the sense of anybody distinctive. I think about my interest is, where do we get the spaces where those two things come together, where we can use people's human recognition of each other, but actually in this space are prepared to begin to look at what the problems actually are, their emotional relationship to them, and what changes might be possible. And that's the trick.
Now, a question that I've always wondered about, two societies probably couldn't be closer on God's earth, Scotland and Northern Ireland. Blood of our blood and bone of our bone, perhaps. Scotland, a serious sectarian problem. You provided an invaluable help to the administration I led, but to successive Scottish governments. But Scottish society, despite that serious sectarian difficulty, never descended into the sort of violence that we saw in Northern Ireland. I'm interested if you've got any insight into why Scotland pulled back from that sectarian brink, where in Northern Ireland descended into the Troubles. Is there any particular clue you can give us?
Well, there's a couple of things. I mean, obviously, sectarianism never defined Scotland's political discussion in the same way. I mean, here, the issue of sectarianism can never be separated from issues of where does the border go and nationalism and control over politics. And in Scotland, sectarianism was a significant issue in communities. It certainly shaped people's experience of immigration. The economy at times was affected by it, and you have institutions which reflect some of that story in some places. Of course you do. The reality is that once violence starts, you have more grounds for resentment than you ever had. And in Scotland, thankfully, it never, in general, apart from the odd instant, escalated up to that point, which was that people had an actual experience that they were under threat in their house, or under threat when they went in the street, or they wore the wrong colour. It was an exceptional instant when that happened. Here, I'm afraid, it's got a pattern, and it has organisation, and it has a symbol, and a political cause on all sides. And that means that it's quite hard to switch off, because you can go down the street very quickly and meet people who say, sectarianism isn't a theory for me. It's what happened to my dad. It's what happened to my family. It's the reason I can't do this or that. And I think in Scotland, luckily, it never quite took the kind of cancerous form of the disease. It's still a disease, but it hasn't actually quite eaten into the structure in the same way.
But if we take a quick look through Irish history, there have been periods in Irish history, in the 1797, for example, where the United Irishmen, United Presbyterians in the north of Ireland, and Catholics in the south of Ireland, particularly the southwest of Ireland, and then the national question was there wasn't seen as a religious divide at all. Some of the great figures of Irish nationalism have been Protestants. Charles Stewart Parnell, for example, was a Protestant. How did the religion become the defining feature of the political cause?
Well, you're absolutely right. Of course, it's a complicated matter. There are different phases and forms of this. Religion and politics mixed in different ways in Ireland. And it created an Irish politics, which is separate from the other places too, because every Orangeman would also agree that they are involved in a certain form of Irish politics. Nevertheless, the long history of Britain was as a state which was defending a kind of a Protestant settlement against Catholic powers for a long time. That created serious local problems and serious issues in Ireland. And that has lasted and modernised in the 19th century, so that unionism and nationalism especially unionism, became a defence of a certain kind of idea of liberty and of freedom. And I think that once violence, as I said, gets into that story, people aren't then discussing ideas anymore. They're defending themselves against their enemies. And once that happens, it's not just a question of, do I agree with you? It's, can I live with you? And once it's, can I live with you? We have then got a lot of work to get through, because it's, I might even be able to say, I can see the value of a united Ireland. That would be one possible idea. But I don't trust you running it, so I'm against it. Or the other way around, I don't find the United Kingdom that uncomfortable. But something, what you did to my family makes it impossible for me to reconcile. So we have both a story of different ideas competing, but we also have people who are trying to work through what's there for them. And that can get easily picked up in a time of fragility or fear, and that always has been our history.
You mentioned a couple of memorable moments of reconciliation, the death of the young policeman and who gathered at his funeral. The Reverend Ian Paisley and Martin McGuinness together as First Minister and Deputy First Minister of Northern Ireland. Is there any event that you could look to in the future, any gathering where you might look at that and say, not that our work is finished, but listen, I can see the sunlight through the clouds?
If you're talking a kind of big television event, of course, the removal of the walls in Belfast would be a dramatic moment. We still have peace walls between communities here, which are still there because the population still feel that if they came down, they'd be at risk. So the removal of those, not because some group has left, but because they actually want to work through, it's obviously always a dramatic moment. I think as the immigration debate's going on, we're one of the places where immigration might actually be a very good thing for us, because it would take us out of the local kind of obsession and give us an opportunity to put our history into context, that we're part of a wider globe. And so sometimes actually the people who have brought the biggest change have been unexpected people who've come here from, and since the peace process, one of the biggest changes was the arrival of people rather than the departure of people from Northern Ireland, and that would be a great symbol. If you look at the changes that have happened in Ireland south of the border in the last 30 years, Ireland has almost reimagined itself as a country where people might not just leave and sing sad songs about the departure, but actually be a place where people would want to come or return to, that they've come away from, and then change the way in which it operates. And I suppose if we could participate, and I'm not particularly hung up on where the constitutional border lies, but I would say to you, if we in the north could begin to participate in that kind of experience, that we have rejoined the world rather than are just obsessed by our peace walls, that would be a big change.
And of course, the Irish Republic could no longer be described as a theocratic state in any sensible sense. So perhaps the Irish state has been transformed rather more substantially than the British state in recent years.
I think Ireland has gone through huge changes, and the changes are to do with economic success, but they're also to do with a feeling that and this is where Europe's been important for them. Within Europe, I think for Ireland, it was no longer an obsessional relationship with history and with England. It became a bigger story, and they were able to kind of talk differently. And I think one of the consequences of that was lots of people came back, lots of new people arrived, the political conversation began to change, and so the theocratic issue has begun to change. So in the last 2 years, Ireland has not just changed the law on emotive moral issues like abortion or gay marriage, it has done so by vote. That wasn't done by an elite deciding this was time to happen. That was done by popular vote, and that's actually, I think, almost unique across the globe. So it does show that change is possible, and that under certain circumstances, things begin to move, and things which were thought of as impossible or very unlikely, even 20 years ago, have now happened.
And finally, Professor Morrow, is the European issue still got some way to run in terms of its impact on the north of Ireland? Not so much now in where the customs border is going to be located, because that looks like it's going to be in Irish Sea. Thinking more about the European issue in terms of affecting the outlook and mind of the people. Is that got some impact still to be felt?
I think the European issue will run probably for decades. You will know as well as I do that the consequences for the constitution of the UK are absolutely unsettled. So if things happen in Scotland, I'm not sure that will be unnoticed here. In fact, I'm absolutely sure it will have massive consequences. The way in which we relate to the rest of the world may be defined by where the border goes and how the border operates. And so I don't want to be too predictive, because actually I'm not even sure where precisely we are going, but I'm 100% sure that we're still going to be wrestling with the consequences of this conversation for quite a long time.
Professor Morrow, thank you very much. And now, in the interest of Celtic unity, I'm going to present you with a quaich, Scots Gaelic, and the one stipulation I would have for passing round all your friends is only Scotch, none of this Irish stuff.
I'll see if I can follow that up. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Morrow.
Professor Duncan Morrow is an example of a rare but important breed. One of those who have worked to transcend political and community differences and enable the peace. 30 years of troubles have been followed by 20 years of peace, and that sometimes fragile but always precious state has held, despite a variety of political pressures over the last 2 decades. None of these has been more challenging than Brexit, which has provoked uncertainty in both communities. Unionists because of the proposed border in the Irish Sea, and nationalists because of the fear of losing the European Union guarantor to the Good Friday Agreement. In the next 2 shows, we listen to the views of unionist and nationalist politicians and to community activists. They indicate both new thinking and reassessment taking place across both communities to find a way forward for all of the people of Northern Ireland.